Good morning. I'm Renee Franker with Cabinet Communications and the moderator for today's event. Thank you for joining us for a briefing on the report following the independent review of the response to the 2019 Hidden Valley Elementary School incident. We are joined by Premier Sandy Silver and lawyer Amanda Rogers. Thank you to Mary Teason for providing our ASL interpretation, and please note there is no French translation today. Following the remarks from our speakers, we will go to the media for a round of questions. We'll call you by name and you will each have 2 questions. Before we begin with our speakers, I'd like to verify that everyone can hear us. If any of the reporters are having problems, please email ecoinfo@yukon.ca. I will now hand it over to Premier Silver.
Thank you very much, Renee. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. I'm here in the traditional territory of the Kwantlen First Nation and the T'Anquatchie Council. I am joined today by Vancouver-based lawyer Amanda Rogers. At the request of Education Minister Jeannie McLean, Ms. Rogers conducted an independent review of the response to the 2019 incident at Hidden Valley Elementary School. The independent review began in October 2021 and is now complete. Yesterday, Ms. Rogers provided Minister McLean with the independent review report. This independent review provides the first detailed account of what happened after allegations of child sexual abuse were raised at Hidden Valley Elementary School in 2019. The independent review was wide-ranging and involved parents directly impacted by the events at Hidden Valley Elementary School, along with officials from all of the departments and agencies involved in the response to the incident. My cabinet ministers waived cabinet confidentiality to ensure all available information was provided to Ms. Rogers for her review. The independent review report includes a number of findings about the incident and the multi-agency response, as well as a number of recommendations to improve how incidents of this kind are handled in the future. I have asked Amanda to join me today to walk us through the results of her independent review and the recommendations in the report. I want to thank Amanda for all of her work in completing this review over the past few months. I know that she has fully invested herself into this review, meeting with parents on a number of occasions, and speaking directly with a number of government and RCMP officials to gather information and to compile her report. I also want to thank everyone that participated in this very tough review. Without further ado, I'll hand it over to Ms. Rogers to share her findings.
Thank you, Premier Silver, and thanks to all of you that are here today. I echo those comments about the participation of everybody in the review. Obviously, the review wouldn't have been comprehensive without the participation of all of those who I spoke with. And I acknowledge this in the report. I hope everybody's had a chance to read it, but I found really everybody I spoke to very candid, honest, and compassionate and caring, and taking on this review. It was the willingness to throw open and to learn from this experience and to really get to the bottom of what exactly went wrong. I think everybody knows there's something that went wrong, and it was publicly acknowledged by governments even before I started this review, but really just dissecting where it went so wrong, and more importantly, I think, how to prevent something like this from happening in the future, to ensure that a situation like this would be better handled and that parents and families would be better served if this kind of unfortunate incident arose in the future. So obviously the backdrop of this review is troubling and difficult subject matter. And so, there were a lot of emotions involved, including my own. It's not an easy thing to undertake, but I just hope that some positive changes can be made as a result of the review, and that some answers to questions can be provided. A lot of the people I spoke with just really wanted to know why and like what happened and how did it come to be that decision was made not to send a communication to parents. And I think that really is what spurred this review, and what what this review was designed to look at is why wasn't a communication sent, and how was that decision landed on. So in terms of process, and I set this out in the review, it's a big undertaking, and writing a report of this nature is challenging to ensure you've got the level of detail that really tells a comprehensive story, narrative about what happened, but doesn't, but the narrative doesn't get lost in tons of detail. And so I've really tried to tell it in a narrative way, in a chronological, sensible way to explain exactly what was going on in different levels of government, in the public, in the criminal justice system, and just dovetail all those things together to explain all of the different pieces that were going on, and use those findings about what factually happened to ground recommendations about identifying where things went wrong and what could be done to prevent that. So again, in terms of process, I started this review in October, as Premier Silver mentioned, and I came to Yukon to meet with government officials. At that time, I spoke to a lot of government employees, both in positions that had direct involvement in this matter, and those who are newly in positions that would be tasked with responding to this type of thing. And that was all very, very helpful. And I can say and convey that no one feels good about the way that this went down, and I think every individual employee who had any kind of involvement with this feels some personal sense of responsibility for it. And so that's how the review started. And I was given a lot of documents. Along the way, I've asked for a lot more documents, and I've been provided a lot more documents as things came up in my interviews with other people, or I became aware of analogous policies or procedures that exist in different departments. I would ask for those, and I found everybody very forthcoming with information. So that was very helpful. Once I had a chance to review more documents, I was able to meet with parents at that government organized parents meeting in November. And after that, a lot of families came forward wanting to talk to me as part of this review. And I've spoken with many parents of students, both past and present, those more directly impacted by the actions of William Auclair Bellemare, but also those who may not have been directly impacted, but still have very strong feelings about the government's handling of the matter, and lots of interesting insights into the impact of all of it. So that's how the review took place. And I also spoke with former government employees as well. Most of those interviews were done by Zoom because of the pandemic, unfortunately, but and some by telephone. But that was the process. And from that, I formulated this report that you've had a chance to review. I think, and I want to leave a lot of time for questions, but I think, if I can just at a high level explain some of the conclusions I've reached. And I know that a lot of the information about the chronology has been publicly disseminated already. I think that people know sort of a general timeline of what happened, but just to set that out, this allegation first came forward to the school in November in 2019. And I think one thing that government handled very well was the labor relations side of things. I mean, when the allegation came forward, it was immediately brought to the RCMP, and William was immediately removed from the school. He was placed on administrative suspension, and once his conviction was secured, his employment was terminated. And that's pretty textbook way to deal with a criminal allegation against an employee. So I think it's worth mentioning that part was handled well. What wasn't handled well, and what has outraged parents and the public more generally, is the government's failure to communicate about the allegation and the fact that William had been removed from the school. And I think this is also public knowledge at this point, but that there was clearly a communication that was contemplated at the time in December of 2019, and it was drafted, and that document circulated within government. It was drafted by Communications and Education. It went to the Public Service Commission, who asked for input from the Department of Justice. And it's clear that the communications employee in education was also talking with the RCMP and getting information from them about what kind of communication should or could or ought to be put out. Well, probably not the ought to, and I'll get to that. I think a real failing here is that that information was disseminated upwards. And that is hugely problematic. And I think that probably the biggest systemic failing here was allowing the important information about the legal advice about what the government could say publicly in light of all of these considerations, and very valid considerations like a publication ban that was imminent, to protect the rights of the victim, right, and the identity of the victim and the criminal justice process. And of course, the Department of Education believed that there was an ongoing RCMP investigation happening at the time and was concerned about interfering with the criminal investigation. And then, of course, there's just generally privacy considerations about what information about employees can be publicly conveyed, and that. And that information was filtered up, as I mentioned, and I think it's hugely problematic because, as I point out in the report, legal advice is just that, right? It's advice, and it's not always to be adhered to, and it must be interacted with, because as soon as you start changing the facts, the advice changes. And also, as I point out in the report, legal advice is given through a very narrow lens, especially when it's coming from the Department of Justice. It's not looking, holistically at the Department of Education's wider obligations, reporting obligations to the public, or certainly to parents. And it seemed also to be looking at it more like a public communication versus a targeted communication to specific parents whose children may have been impacted by this. And so there was, I believe, a misinterpretation or oversimplification or misunderstanding about what could be conveyed and to whom and when. And so what we see is that communication not going out in December. There is a briefing note that went to the minister at the time that was approved. It was written by the communications department and went up. But that briefing note was intended and designed for responding to questions, if asked, about this matter. And that's clear throughout this, is that the communications perspective was looked at from a reactive point of view. Like, if you're asked questions, here's what you can say. And what was missed was this question about, but what's our positive obligation to report the information? And that just doesn't seem to have been contemplated. And it's certainly not contained in the briefing note. There's two briefing notes that went out, one in November, just after the allegation was made, and one later in March, just before the conviction, but after the guilty plea. And neither of those briefing notes say anything about the departmental response, other than to say in the earlier briefing that the RCMP and the school were working together, and the criminal investigation was ongoing. There wasn't any reporting of, and we're not sending out a communication because we understand we're not able to, or anything like that. That just was not an angle that was considered. And I think, again, it's partially or entirely perhaps because of this lack of coordination and lack of getting the right people involved and making sure that their response was coordinated. I mean, even in the Department of Justice, the advice went over, and again, it's being delivered to a comms analyst, which is like an inappropriate mechanism for conveying legal advice. And it's not even being reported up in the Department of Justice either. So I know there was lots of speculation. I heard from parents about Minister McPhee's involvement or knowledge. And it's no doubt she had knowledge that an allegation had been made and that there was a criminal investigation underway. But there was no knowledge about the department deciding not to send a communication, or why. It just was never disseminated upwards. So I think that's one of the major findings that I have. I guess the other one is really, I mean, it's fair to say people just, especially those on the ground, school administrators, and those tasked with responding, didn't have any clear guidance. There were no policies, or guidelines that set out what needed to be done. And that's why leadership and oversight was so important. And yet it wasn't sought, nor was it offered, right? It was just dealt with on the ground by people who didn't have training or experience, or procedural or policy guidance in what to do. And no professional advice was sought on that. And it meant that, this terrible mistake was made, not to send the communication in December. And then later, that decision was never revisited. Because even if, and I find in the report, there was nothing prohibiting a communication in December when it was contemplated. But even if that decision was made not to send it in December, because of those valid considerations, and I do think that, there was consideration of important and valid obstacles that needed to be considered. I don't think the obstacles prevented any communication. But even if that was the conclusion, to err on the side of caution at that time, what was missing, of course, was a revisiting of that decision. Like, there was no follow-up from anybody in the Department of Education, in the Public Service Commission, in education. We know that the pieces continue moving forward in terms of the labor relations piece, because William's employment was terminated in, I believe it was March 2020. And so clearly there's an awareness of the criminal justice process. But again, this piece about communication obligations, and revisiting, well, okay, we didn't send a communication then, but can we send one now? It just wasn't done. There's no internal communication or discussion or contemplation about that at all. And again, not to justify that in any way, because it was wrong. And I find that the response of government was inadequate. So I don't make these comments to justify, but just merely to contextualize and explain, how could that be, right? Like, how could that have happened? And I think there's, a multitude of factors that explain it. There's no one thing to point at, and there's no one person to point at. And I know I spoke to parents last night to present these findings, and, there was at least, one or two parents who really feel like one person ought to be held accountable for this. And believe me, if I felt that one person ought to be held entirely accountable, I would have found that. I have no hesitation to find that. But I really do believe this is a systemic failing of information not getting up and information not going down. And also with the RCMP. Information wasn't shared with the RCMP. And of course, we know that the RCMP wasn't conducting an investigation at all. And they've publicly apologized for their failure to do so. Of course, RCMP is the entity that has responsibility for identifying victims and pursuing criminal charges, or laying them, I should say. That's the RCMP's job, and they didn't do their job, and they've already candidly admitted that, and they're undertaking their own review. So I think that's really it. I'm happy to walk through the recommendations, or to open it up to questions. I think the last piece, I'm just looking at my report as I comment, but and they all fit together, right? This lack of training and orientation and onboarding. I just think that, again, really people need to have clear guidance about what to do in these situations and to know who's responsible. The Department of Education has drafted a policy that sets out the communications responses that are necessary for for particular types of incidents, depending on their severity and to whom to whom these communications should go and the nature of these communications. I think that's a really positive step, and I comment on that in the report. That I think that it could be fleshed out more. I think that it's really more than just communications, because here, while that's certainly where the public outcry lies, there was a lack of coordination, within, right, and within these agencies, as Premier Silver said, the RCMP and the Department of Education were not sharing information and having the kinds of communications you would expect and that were necessary clearly to make sure that a fulsome investigation was done. So that is one of my recommendations as well, just a clear policy on information sharing and who is going to be the person coordinating that, and to make sure that all the information that's necessary flows, and that everybody is aware of the exceptions in privacy legislation for criminal investigations and the right of the RCMP to have this information, because there was some lack of clarity about that later when the investigation was reopened in 2021. Well, I think I'll just stop it there and open it for questions, because I don't want to take too much time talking, and I know you've all had a chance to read it, and I think I've commented on the most important findings of the report, so I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Amanda. I will now hand it back to Premier Silver.
Thank you very much, Ms. Rogers. I appreciate it. After receiving the report, Minister McLean's first priority was to share it with the parents and families of Hidden Valley, which she did yesterday. The independent review was a commitment that Minister McLean made directly to the parents last fall, and it was important that they received the report first. Ms. Rogers and Minister McLean held a meeting with Hidden Valley parents and family yesterday evening and discussed the report, as Amanda alluded to today, and also answered questions. Following the meeting, we released the report publicly, as you know, and the report, for those who don't know, can be found on our website at yukon.ca currently. I want to thank the parents who participated in last night's meeting. I can't imagine how difficult that would have been. I know that there's a lot of anger and frustration, legitimate anger and legitimate frustration. And I know that people want to see action taken to address what's happened. This independent review report is an important step in uncovering what happened and also working to rebuild trust, hopefully rebuild trust with the Hidden Valley school community and the broader educational community in the territory as well. Our government and also the RCMP have acknowledged that this situation was not handled properly. And on behalf of the entire government and as Premier, I apologize. I apologize directly to the parents, to the families, to the Hidden Valley school community, to teachers, administration, staff, and all Yukoners, really. I'm truly sorry that this happened. And I know that we do need to do better. This report will help us. It'll help us to understand what happened and how we can work together to prevent it from happening again. Now, we can't change what happened, but we do now have a much clearer picture of what needs to happen to address the breakdown in the system. The lack of policy to guide the Department of Education in responding to these circumstances, this is a critical gap that needs to be addressed immediately. Last night, Minister McLean informed parents that our government accepts all of the recommendations in this report and will begin to implement them immediately. To that end, I have instructed Stephen Mills, the Deputy Minister of the Executive Council Office, the top-ranking public servant of the Yukon government, to establish a Deputy Minister's Committee to oversee the implementation. The independent review report recommends focusing on the Department of Education, but they have implications for all levels of government departments as well, including how they work together and how they work outside of partner agencies as well. It's extremely important that we address that immediately. I have asked Deputy Minister Mills to develop an implementation action plan and to present it to Cabinet by February the 18th. Now, last night, Minister McLean also invited parents at Hidden Valley Elementary School to form a parents' advisory committee to provide advice directly to the minister that will help us to implement change and improve supports for school families. Ongoing input from the school community is vital. It's extremely important to guide us on what they need as we work through a restorative process. Now, these preliminary steps that our government has taken make it very necessary. They're very necessary to make sure that the changes to the public service happen and we improve how we handle these matters going forward. We're still reviewing the report that we received yesterday, and there are 3 more independent reviews still underway as well. And we do look forward to the results of these additional reviews so that we can get the fullest picture of what happened and the steps that are necessary to ensure that this doesn't happen again. I'll leave it at that and, again, open it up for questions.
Thank you, Premier, and thank you, Ms. Rogers. We will now move on to the question and answer session with media on the phone lines and in the room. A reminder to reporters, please identify which speaker you would like to answer your question before you start, and please also remember to mute and unmute yourselves. We'll first go to the reporter in the room and start with Haley at Yukon News.
Thank you. My first question would be for Premier Silver. We just heard Ms. Rogers say that the report doesn't find one person accountable for what happened, but I am curious, is there going to be are you planning any professional discipline for some of the people that were involved, particularly high-ranking? I know there are parents who feel like that's what accountability would look like, to see a resignation from the deputy minister or the former minister. Is that action going to take place? If it isn't, what do you have to say to those parents who feel let down by that?
I'll say right up front from the report, as I read it, and I spent the whole day yesterday after receiving it, reviewing and rereading, going over the recommendations. And the key message today for family, for Yukoners, for the school community, there was an absolute critical breakdown in the system. Also found here was no one person or decision is responsible for the response to this incident. What was also found was there was no attempt at a cover-up, no ill intent by any officials. The independent review revealed significant, long-standing policy gaps in the Department of Education and the government as a whole. We accept and will implement all of the report's recommendations to ensure that this doesn't happen again. And also, key finding number 1, the educational assistant was removed from the school, was removed immediately upon the Hidden Valley Elementary School being made aware of the allegations, and therefore posed no longer any threat to any students. That doesn't change the fact that the communications was broken down from that point on, and those serious gaps need to be addressed, and they need to be addressed immediately. Thank you.
Haley, do you have a follow-up question?
I do. This one's a little bit more specific, I guess. It's for Ms. Rogers. When CBC broke this story to the public, there was one lawsuit ongoing and a second was launched during the fallout. I'm wondering, over the course of your investigation, did you find the delayed response to accept responsibility initially have anything to do with those lawsuits and the department feeling legally vulnerable?
Certainly not in the initial, because the lawsuits came later. There is reference in terms of the response, and I didn't speak to this earlier, but the response in 2021 when the CBC broke the story July 16th, I've reviewed and I highlight some of those communications internally about how it took the government a few weeks to respond to parents. And there was a concern raised at that time about the concern that if the government made a public statement about it, would it look like it was trying to influence the lawsuit or make an inappropriate comment? so that was raised as a concern, and ultimately, obviously, the communication went out and did go out to parents, but it certainly was raised as, they didn't want to look like there was anything inappropriate and trying to like unduly influence public or the courts or anything like that.
Thank you. We'll now move to the phone lines and start with John at CKRW.
Hi. My question is directed to Ms. Rogers. The summary of recommendations doesn't include anything about vetting when it comes to future hiring process, be it for teachers or EAs. Was that anything that was considered when putting forward your recommendations, any form of additional vetting or screening process when hiring? How did this slip past the government in the first place was more or less my first thought when kind of coming up with this.
Yeah, it does mention in the report that he was vetted. He did undergo a criminal records check when he was hired, which is the policy of government. So, and there was nothing on his record. He didn't have any criminal records. So, there wasn't really anything to latch a finding onto about that because there were no red flags that ought to have been caught or that would have been caught. He was vetted according to the policy. He passed the criminal records check. I have heard, though, in my discussions and interviews with people that there are some changes afoot in terms of updating and renewing criminal records checks. My understanding, and again, this wouldn't have made any difference in this case, so it's sort of outside of my mandate because William did not have a criminal record at all. So even if they've done ongoing criminal record checks every year or 2 years, which other jurisdictions do every 2 years, I'm told. It wouldn't have changed anything in this case. But I do understand that that's being contemplated and may have already been implemented. There's certainly discussions going on about having ongoing criminal record checks. I think my understanding is the policy that existed at the time was that criminal record checks were done when people transferred positions. But if you stayed in the same position, there was no requirement. Although there is an obligation on individual employees to report those things to their employer. There wasn't like a formal criminal records check, but I don't make any findings about it because nothing turned on it or would have been different even with that different policy.
Thank you. Do you have a follow-up question, John?
No, thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll now move to Tim at the Whitehorse Star.
Yes, good morning. My first question would be for the Premier. I noticed in the report that it says that you personally weren't aware of the situation until sometime after the CBC report came out in the summer. Do you find that an acceptable situation, or was that kind of embarrassing for you?
I find that acceptable.
Do you have a follow-up question, Tim?
Yes, would be for Amanda Rogers or Ms. Rogers. Looking again at your report and seeing all the dysfunction happening in the government departments, and particularly the Department of Education, were you surprised to see that level of disorganization, if not outright unprofessional and amateurism?
Well, I've said to people, I do a lot of work with different governments, different provinces and jurisdictions. What I don't think is surprising is the kind of siloing of departments. That, is a common problem, I think, in governments where departments are sort of just operating independently, and sometimes the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing. I was recently dealing with a similar situation, not similar and factually, but just that sort of situation where you've got two different branches of government doing initiatives and things that actually conflicted with one another, and ultimately ended up in a pretty big fiasco because commitments were made by one branch of government, and they completely undermined and conflicted with commitments made to other groups by other branch of government. So I don't think it's unique to this government. I do think that as Premier Silver said, there were some policy gaps. Unfortunately, and it's a very unfortunate world we live in, that, somebody like William with an inclination, of that nature, that's where somebody who, looks to sexually abuse children, they go to be around children. And that means that schools are a place where, unfortunately, this kind of behavior can occur, right? And so it's not, although it's disturbing and awful that this took place, it's not surprising. It certainly shouldn't have been something that came as a complete surprise that this could ever happen in a school. And so I think that's a surprising part to me is the is the failure to have policies and training and things to deal with that type of situation, because I think that in other jurisdictions, there are clear policies to deal with this kind of situation when it arises, and they do, unfortunately, these situations do arise. So
Thank you. We'll now move to Dirk at the Canadian Press.
Hello, I'd like to ask Amanda Rogers if if you can, the current standing of the accused, what his current standing is with the court system right now.
Well, my understanding is, and I don't have direct knowledge or pipeline to that, but my understanding is there's been 7 additional charges laid against William, and I know that it's proceeding through the criminal justice system, but I don't believe there's been even a first appearance on that yet. I think the criminal investigation, and the RCMP obviously could answer this much better than I could, but I believe the investigation is still ongoing, and I know that there have been additional charges laid, and that will play itself out. But it's in early stages of the criminal justice proceedings, as far as I'm aware. The charges have been laid. I don't think there's been any other steps yet.
Thank you. Dirk, do you have a follow-up question?
Sure, I'd like to ask the Premier. Part of the recommendations, or you're saying the recommendations are that something like this could never happen, or you don't want something like this to happen again. And the person who is accused or convicted did not have a criminal record before, and he underwent a criminal record check. But how confident are you feeling that after this report and the recommendations are implemented, that this kind of situation could be prevented in the future?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, in this particular case, we have an individual with no former convictions, no criminal record, who still did this unbelievable behavior in our public school system. And, as far as being able to identify those who are going to cause harm, I think Amanda said it well. There's situations that you're just not going to be able to, to deal with. However, the ability to communicate with RCMP, the ability to understand, how communication is supposed to flow, the importance of why that information needs to flow. I can't imagine a situation where, parents and their kids don't have an opportunity to address what's happened immediately within their own homes, to be able to hopefully repair some damage. Right across this country, you're going to see damage in the organizations that attract kids, and the institutions in which they're studying. There's going to be predators, and we need to make sure that the criminal justice system works to incarcerate these individuals. We don't want to interfere with publication bans, but we also want to make sure that there's a system and a policy in place so that we can tighten gaps between ongoing investigations, RCMP responsibilities, government responsibilities, checklists to make sure on a very continuous basis that these policies are being adhered to. And we have to start even before that. We have to develop these policies. As Amanda pointed out in this report, it's been years. There has never been this policy. And that's unacceptable for any government, to not have a policy to deal specifically with these horrendous types of of incidences. When I take a look at the key findings, first and foremost in my mind is we as a government have to take steps to better inform and support parents. And that's where we're going to focus our attention right now. There's a whole bunch of things on the side of the RSMP, but we need to focus in on our own policies right now. The things that we can do to make sure that if and when something like this happens in any of our institutions, the communication flows readily. And I agree with Ms. Brown. Ms. Rogers. There's recommendations. There's justice can give you recommendations. Justice can give you direction and inform you what to be careful of. But we have an obligation as well.
Thank you. We'll now move to Claudiane at Radio Canada.
Yes, I would like to hear, Ms. Rogers, in your opinion, if you could walk us through step by step, although briefly, how this situation should have been handled in a perfect world. How, based on your recommendations, how this incident should have been handled.
Sure, and I say this in the report, not that specifically, but that in 2021, when the CBC broke the story about William's conviction, it was handled much better internally, and because I think at that point, when parents and the public were writing in and the press was calling for information, it was recognized that this was a very significant incident that required high-level and coordinated response. And you see that happen. And that's not to say that the response was flawless, that it couldn't have been better and faster. It should have been faster. All the mechanisms that happened ought to have played out faster. And I find that. But I think that, that situation shows that when there's a significant event, it's dealt with by a high level, and the assistant deputy ministers of various departments and the deputy ministers, they're all on this email chains that are going back and forth. And I explain that a little bit in the report. So that's certainly the level that this should have been dealt with at. And I think, the significance of this event, coupled with the concerns about the privacy and the RCMP investigation and all of that ongoing, it wasn't recognized as something that needed a high level response. And, and that's in and of itself was a problem. And I think influenced partly by the lack of the policies and coordination. So, in terms of what ought to have happened, I mean, of course, the first step is that there should have been a clear policy about who's responsible for handling these types of things. And that's made clear in this draft policy that it's the assistant deputy minister who is the liaison with the RCMP and who's meant to handle, at that level, right? Because it shouldn't be dealt with just at a school-based level when you're engaging these kinds of important responsibilities. So having better policies and some training about, what needs to happen. And I didn't mention in my earlier comments, but onboarding training as well for the Department of Education in terms of like understanding what the other pieces of government, what their function is and what they do and when you need to involve them or not involve them, because there wasn't really clear policy about that either. Like it was just, even the Department of Justice getting looped in at all to look at that communication, that wasn't education going to the Department of Justice and saying, we want your input on this, come to a meeting and let's all talk about this. That never happened. It was the Public Service Commission, who again was looking at it through its narrow lens, right? Everybody has a narrow lens, and the Public Service Commission's narrow lens is labor relations and human resources, right? And they're looking at it like, what can we say about an employee, and what do we need to do with this employee? And that's the lens they looked at it through. And they shouldn't have a communications person vetting the communication that goes out to parents, because one, that's not a labor relations matter, and two, that it needed to be looked at in a holistic way, which it wasn't. It bounced around the silos, and people, in a middle level of the silos were dealing with it, and each coming at it from their own perspective, and nobody coordinating and looking at the matter holistically. and engaging. So I think in a perfect world with hindsight and, you know, a do-over, it would look a lot like that, where people were having ongoing communications within those various departments, and like having a cohesive, comprehensive strategy in terms of dealing with it, because every little bit was being dealt with by you know, the individuals that were responsible for those pieces of it, but the pieces weren't cohesive and they weren't coordinated.
Thank you. Claudiane, do you have a second question?
Yes. Mr. Premier, this is yet another report on shortfalls in the education system. You have bluntly indicated you were not informed and that was not acceptable. Yet you also indicate that there seems to be no consequences for any of the staff involved. So how can you, Connors, believe there will be any change? And the first Auditor General report on education dates back, almost 10 years or so? What will change?
The policy. You know, again, to say that there's no ramifications from this report, I would disagree with you, Claudiane. This report is very balanced and got to the heart of the truth of the matter, which is really important in us addressing and focusing our lens. New policy needs to be established. New protocols need to be established. You know, there's and in that is connecting senior leadership, including cabinet, to make sure that they are properly informed. This is what we're focusing in on. Now, I know in the fall, we went through a whole legislative session where conclusions were already drawn, and I guess people are trying to conclude from there. I'm sticking to the facts of this report, and we are going to immediately implement the facts of this report. Look, Claudiane, I worked in the education system, you know, for 15 years before coming over into this position as MLA for Klondike and as the leader of the government. And you know, we have an opportunity here to change the department. We do, and I think you're seeing change happening already. You know, inclusivity and special needs change is happening through Minister McLean already. We're seeing in our few years here, we've worked really hard, including the former minister and the current minister, on changes to the First Nations, the education system, and what wonderful news we've heard just this week in those endeavors. And we always say, just government-wide, as far as every government that's going through COVID, if we don't change how we do things anyway, this is the opportunity for us to see a lot of change. We're going to focus our attention in on the recommendations of this report, and we are going to move forward very quickly with as many agencies as possible, with caring individuals, family members, school community, assistance in the educational community, which I have to say from my experience is profound in the Yukon. We have some great educators, we've got some great schools, and we have an opportunity to change some policies in the Department of Education that existed while I was a teacher, right forward to today. As far as individuals, the report is very clear about individuals. I'm not on a witch hunt here. I want to make sure that we heal people. I want to make sure that we use our resources properly. I want to make sure we communicate properly. This can't happen again. We can't be in a situation where folks that are outside of their breadth are, stymied in where their decision-making goes or aren't reporting where they should. And I think as Amanda alluded to, if you take a look at if you read the report, you did see change already happening as far as that mechanism you went. You saw in the report pages, a second round where this is happening, and communication did flow up to cabinet, or to the minister responsible. And advice was taken as advice from the Department of Justice. So we've got a long way to go. We really, really do. There's long-standing systematic issues that we absolutely have to deal with here, and a lack of policy. And that all contributed to where we are here today. So in accepting these reports, It's important to know that we take steps to prevent further harm, and I will do everything I can to make sure that further harm is prevented.
Thank you. We'll now move on to Jackie at CBC.
Good morning. My first question is for Amanda Rogers. Ms. Rogers, you mentioned you've done a lot of work with different governments. I'm just wondering if you've ever seen a case like this, obviously not with the same set of facts, but just in terms of this level of systemic failure and the impact it has, and tied into that, just based on your experience these past couple of months, whether you have faith that that your recommendations will be fully implemented.
On that, have I seen a situation like this before? I mean, this is such a unique set of circumstances. So I think I made that comment earlier that it's certainly not unusual for the big machine of government to have components doing things that other components are not fully aware of, or get not looking fully holistically at things. So I've seen that in a very general sense. This isn't the kind of situation that arises very very often. So I can't say I've experienced or seen anything that's directly analogous. In terms of the recommendations being adopted, I do have faith that they will be, and I think I said this when I went on CBC earlier to ask parents to reach out and contact me, which was I wouldn't have done this review if I didn't think that that there were going to be changes made out of it, and I didn't believe that the recommendations were going to be implemented. I mean, I personally find this subject matter very challenging, and I really what made me interested in taking on this project, this review process, was the genuine willingness of those in leadership positions to make positive changes. And as Premier Silver pointed out, those changes were already underway. I could see that there was this collective desire to learn from this and to be better and do better. And so I think that those changes are already underfoot. And I do think that, unfortunately, it does sometimes take, a situation to reveal the lack of policy or training or the, unpreparedness to deal with something. That's often how these gaps are detected. That's an unfortunate reality. And in a perfect world, the policies would have been reviewed in a different light, in a different context, and been discovered and implemented before this happened, right? But that's not uncommon to identify procedural and policy gaps arising from a situation. There's nothing unique about that. And I do think that the recommendations will be implemented. Especially, I didn't mention the recommendation around special education, but I know Premier Silver touched on it. And I mean, that's something that came out, and it's sort of incidental to this review. And certainly there are people who are far more attuned and with expertise in education that have written on that subject and have looked at the Yukon public education system, and specifically special education, and have made some really positive recommendations about changes that need to happen. And I echo them only because I do think there is some intersection between what happened here and the lack of training for educational assistants and the way that special education is approached in the territory. I do think there's overlap there, and that it was one factor that played into how William's behavior went undetected and why it wasn't discovered earlier. I think that there is some overlap between those things. So long-winded way to say I do think that the recommendations, I have faith, and I hope that they will, and I believe that they will.
touch on that as well. I don't think that was long-winded at all, actually, man. I think that was very concise. But one of the recommendations out of the is also to implement the recommendations of the Office of the Auditor General and their report, and it's the review of inclusive and special education, and you know, this is extremely important work that is underway and will continue with the leadership of Minister McLean here. So, you know. We are doing, you know, as much as we can right now just to review the pages of this report, but I just want to expand on the specifics of the Office of the Auditor General report, and that review of inclusive and special education is extremely important initiative that is part of the recommendations.
Thank you. Do you have a second question, Jackie?
I do. This one's for the Premier. So Premier Silver, as you have noted, and as the report notes, there's no one person to be held responsible for this failure here. However, the report does outline failures on the parts of multiple people on multiple levels, systemic failures. How can people trust in your education department or even your government, given the level of failures outlined here? And as well, where is the education minister or the deputy education minister or Minister McPhee today?
Yeah, so it's a serious matter that concerns the whole government, so I'll address that part first. Why am I here today? This is the first of many conversations that we're going to be having with the public and with the school community. You know, I take this very seriously as the leader of this government, and so that's why I'm here today. I'm here to let Yukoners know that we are accepting the recommendations of this report, and we are taking actions immediately to implement this as well. You know, with regards to, you know, what actions will be happening internally with within the government as far as individuals in the public service. You know, again, we're focusing in from a policy perspective. We're focusing in of the details here of this comprehensive report. This is a lot of really important work that we need to do. I know a lot of questions come around, you know, the responsibility of specific ministers, and I think it's unfortunate that in the fall that narrative was created without evidence, and so we are here reacting to this. I don't want to spend a lot of time today talking about the misleading information of the fall, but, you know, we know from this report, you know, direct quotes, you know, about, you know, no information discovered during this report indicated the government's failure to communicate with families of students at this school was motivated by a desire to conceal or to cover up any information. The report didn't uncover any attempts to conceal information. And these are narratives that we, you know, were hit with all fall as well. So, you know, again, this is an independent review. And this independent review came with a bunch of recommendations, important recommendations based upon fact, based upon, you know, going through with all open cabinet, you know, we waived all of our cabinet privileges and allowed Ms. Rogers to get in there and to give the most fulsome report possible. You know, Minister McLean will be working with the school community, absolutely. You know, our whole cabinet will be working with the special committee that's going to be designed through my top public servant, Mr. Mills, Deputy Minister Stephen Mills, and we will be getting that information quickly, February 18th, as I mentioned. This is a whole of cabinet response to one of the worst, you know, things I've heard of in my 10 plus years as a politician happening in a school system. And we are going to make sure that we implement all of the recommendations. We are going to take swift and decisive action based upon the evidence that has been provided.
Thank you. We'll now move to Patrick at Media Q. Hearing nothing, that does conclude our press conference for today. Thank you to Premier Silver, and thank you to Amanda Rogers, and thank you to all of the media who joined us. Have a wonderful day, everyone, and take care.